Following Jesus' rejection by the nation of Israel in chapters 11 and 12, and his explanatory discourse in 13, Jesus' ministry experienced a dramatic shift in chapters 14 to 17, moving from public presentation to private preparation. And I get that from a NT scholar, Doug Bookman, and I just love his work on the life of Christ. This is kind of his presentation of this transition in Jesus' ministry, where he goes from presenting himself openly to Israel as their Messiah and saturating all of the land of the Jews with this message, sending out his 12 disciples and vindicating that claim by means of miracles in chapters 8 and 9. And he goes from that public presentation to private preparation of his disciples for his impending death. Instead of his message going everywhere, he's seeking to find solitude, and he's even going among the land of the Gentiles in order to get away from the Jews in this final 6 months to a year of his ministry. And during this time, he's avoiding miracles and he's concealing his message through parables. Now, if you pay careful attention to these chapters, you'll notice that Matthew has arranged this material into 4 withdraw cycles, where 4 times it's going to say that Jesus went away from the crowd, usually after some kind of disappointment that he experiences. Look at this chart describing or depicting these withdraw cycles, where after he's rejected by the nation in 11 and 12 and explains this rejection in 13, it says that he went away from there. And then he does some ministry, taught in a synagogue, but then there's more opposition. He's rejected in his own hometown, Nazareth, and then John the Baptist is murdered in chapter 14. And so it says, again, Jesus withdrew from there, does some more ministry, and then another conflict with the Pharisees in chapter 15. And again, he withdrew from there, now into the district of Tyre and Sidon among the Gentiles, does more ministry. We see the Canaanite woman is a Gentile woman, but then the Pharisees follow him, demanding a sign. And so he responds and rebukes the Pharisees, and he departs yet again, teaches his disciples, and then there's further opposition, this time from his own disciple, Peter, misunderstanding Jesus's passion prediction. Well, you kind of get a sense from reading these chapters, 14 to 17, that Jesus is always on the move. Take a look at this other chart. All the verses in blue kind of highlight the motion, the movement of Jesus. He went away, he got into a boat, went to the other side, crossed the lake, went into Gennesaret, withdrew to the area of Tyre and Sidon, walked along the sea, went up a mountain, got into a boat, went into the district of Caesarea Philippi, entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Just constant movement, transition, trying to get away from the crowds. But we see here in orange, the crowds continue to follow him. Great crowds follow him. And when they do, Jesus has compassion on them. Regardless of his trying to seek solitude, he has compassion on these sheep without a shepherd, and he heals them. However, he's also followed by the Pharisees, and he is forced to confront them constantly in this time period as well. And by this point, the Pharisees are fully convinced that Jesus must be stopped. And so here, at this point in Jesus' ministry, Doug Bookman explains that all this constant relocation by Jesus is all so that he can get alone with his disciples and prepare them for his impending death. And the necessity of this private preparation of his disciples is highlighted by the frequent misunderstandings of his disciples in these chapters. They just don't get it. Left and right, they're completely confused. Consider the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. They're like, where are we going to get bread to feed all these people? And then totally fixated on this idea of bread. In another account where Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, they're still fixated on bread. Look at this. And Jesus's critique of their slowness to understand. This is in 16. We'll start in 5, where Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they're like, well, we didn't bring any bread. What are we going to do with this? And Jesus responds to his disciples by saying, for the second time, oh, you of little faith, why are you discussing the fact that we have bread? And then look at these phrases. Don't you perceive? Don't you remember? How is it that you fail to understand? I'm not talking about bread. And then again, when Jesus walks to his disciples on the water, they think it's a ghost. They're afraid to think it's a ghost. And the point of that account is that the disciples still fail to perceive the identity of Jesus. And so he asks them straight up. He says, who do you say that I am? And Peter, he does awesome at this point. He says, you are the Christ. You are Israel's Messiah, the King. But what comes right after that confession of Peter? Well, it's Jesus' first passion prediction. And you remember where we're going with this, the subject of the disciples' misunderstandings. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, says Peter. And then Jesus follows this by saying that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things and be killed. And Peter, who just was given the keys of the kingdom, he rebukes Jesus. Far be it from you, Lord. This will never happen to you. And Jesus says, you are presenting the same temptation to me that the devil did in chapter 4, trying to give me a crown without the cross. And therefore I say, get behind me, Satan. And these misunderstandings are going to form the subject of Jesus's fourth discourse in chapter 18, where in the first verse of this chapter, the disciples are going to ask him, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus is going to take this as an opportunity to teach the true meaning of greatness in his kingdom. And he uses a visual aid in order to do this, invites a little child to come up on his lap, and he explains, whoever humbles himself like this child will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And he's going to use this idea of a child to explain that those who have faith, who are part of his kingdom, who go through the narrow gate, they are the humble and the lowly and the meek. And he continues to use this concept of a child, of a little one, throughout the first half of this discourse. Take a look at Jesus' repetition of this idea in chapter 18, where he says that the child who humbles himself, if you receive such a child, you receive me. But whoever causes a child, a little one, to sin, man, better have a millstone thrown around his neck and thrown into the depths of the sea. He says, do not despise one of these little ones, for their angels always see the face of my Father in heaven. It is not the will of my Father that any of these little ones should perish. God's eye is on the humble. Of course, this is the polar opposite value set of the self-righteous Pharisees, whom so many in Israel are following at this point. Well, Peter is going to initiate the second half of this discourse with a misunderstanding of his own. He asks Jesus, how many times should I forgive my brother who sins against me? How about 7 times? And he's thinking, man, I am so great right now. 7 times, that's a big number. Jesus responds by shocking Peter and insisting that kingdom citizens ought not to forgive 7 times, but 77 times. And he explains this using the parable of the unforgiving servant. Well, all of these teachings here in chapter 18 are policies for the church. The church, which is founded on the forgiveness and reconciliation of Jesus, modeled by him. But get this, the word church, it's hardly anywhere in the Gospels. The word church, never in Mark, never in Luke, never in John, and only 2 times in the book of Matthew. Here in chapter 18 and in chapter 16, where Jesus is going to introduce this concept of the church only after Israel has rejected the kingdom offer. After Israel's rejection, he says that Peter, on this rock, I will build my church. And then this fourth discourse is going to hold up the high calling and the upside down ethic of the church as it waits for the kingdom and as it follows its crucified king. Now, we're going to watch this king as he marches towards Jerusalem and towards the cross and his final conflict with the religious elite in that city one last time in chapters 19 to 23 next.